All right, can everyone hear us online?
Yes, we can.
All right, welcome. We're gonna do roll call.
Alderman Cone. Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. Commissioner Banton,
Present.
Commissioner Bradley,
Present.
Commissioner Fowler,
Present.
Commissioner Garmendia. Present. Commissioner Hernandez,
Present.
Commissioner Hubman,
Present.
Commissioner Keon, Commissioner Sterling, Miller,
Present.
Commissioner Williams, Chair Boaz,
Present.
and you have a quorum of 8.
Thank you, Michelle. So I have taken over Tracy's duties today as vice chair. She is joining us from hopefully sunny California online. Will be back with us at the end of the week. So excited to have her back in STL. We also have a few new commission members beginning with us this month. So we have Commissioner Sterling Miller and Commissioner Daniel Hernandez joining us online. Excited to have you with us this evening. If you want to give a few moments to introduce yourself and maybe a little bit about your background, would be awesome.
All right, go back a little bit. Started my professional career working for CDA in 1980. Planner by education and profession, AICP. Got out of that field and did the energy retrofit work from schools and cities and counties for 25 years. So I worked for St. Louis Public Schools in planning, and I was on LRA chairman here in the city for years, and on the Landmarks Board for over 12 years, served on that. So lifelong St. Louis, live in the Kingsway East neighborhood.
That's very nice. Welcome. Commissioner Hernandez, want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. How are you?
Doing well.
Okay. Well, like you say, my name is Daniel Hernandez. I will tell you a little about my background. I'm originally from Venezuela. I moved here like 15 years ago, where I started my studies as a engineer. I finished that, and I'm currently working for a staffing company. We do light industrial work. In Venezuela, I was working for an engineering company, and that's what I like to join the commission today.
Very good. Well, welcome. Excited to have you both with us. Lovely. We're filling out the roster here, so it's good to have a full commission. That's excellent. So we only have 2 agenda items with us tonight, but first let's start with the approval of the minutes. I have a motion.
Second.
It's been moved by Commissioner Hubman and seconded by Commissioner Garmendia. Call for vote, please.
Alderman Cone. Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. Commissioner Boaz,
Aye.
Commissioner Bradley,
Aye.
Commissioner Fowler, Commissioner Garmendia, Commissioner Hernandez,
Aye.
abstain.
Sure. Commissioner Hernandez, you should abstain since you were not present for the previous meeting. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. Excellent. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Commissioner Hubman,
Aye.
Commissioner Keon, Commissioner Miller,
Abstain.
Commissioner Williams, Chair Banton.
Aye.
And the motion passes with 6 ayes and 2 abstentions.
Thank you. All right, as previously said, we have 2 main items this evening, neither of which include a public hearing. One is a sloop update, and we have some guests with us here tonight to help with that presentation. And the second is a text amendment related to Board Bill 114 about special residential uses, which we heard at our previous commission meeting that underwent some amendment changes at the board. So we will begin with the sloop update, and I will pass it over to Miriam.
Great, I'll kick us off. Yeah, I need to make sure I'm sharing the screen here. Or I launch into something that describing something that people can't see. So, yeah, this item. I think commission has been to be clear with the public, this is not an item tonight where the commission is considering adoption of this plan. This is to provide kind of just an update to make sure that the commission is up to speed, and also for members of the public who want to hear kind of a summary of the status of the plan. Glad you're here with us tonight, because we've been hard at work as a planning team, including our guests here with us tonight, to pull this plan together. This presentation, we're going to take a step back and share a little bit more about the process and the context for this work, because as was made clear kind of in the early part of this meeting, we do have new members of the commission. We want to make sure everybody is up to speed in advance of any potential a future time where this will be considered for adoption. So this is a big update presentation, and the context here is that updating a land use plan like this is the city's land use element of its comprehensive plan, is a pretty significant undertaking that cities really only do every so often, every 10 years, and the city of St. Louis has not comprehensively updated its land use plan since the sloop was initially created in 2005. So this is, I'd say, kind of an important process to be deliberate and thoughtful about. And I think, this is an opportunity for the city. This is not just a routine bureaucratic exercise. This is an opportunity to affirmatively and proudly express an optimistic, but a pragmatically optimistic vision for the city's future. And that's what we have sought to do. So with that, I'll introduce some of our guests here tonight. Daniel Dioka of Interboro Partners, principal in charge, lead firm leading this effort, and then Liz Kramer of Public Design Bureau is also going to help provide more context about the engagement approach and engagement plan, again, to make sure that the whole commission is up to speed on what this process has involved. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz.
Great, thanks everyone. I'm Liz Kramer, Public Design Bureau. So before we jump into talking about what the plan is, I want to give some background about the process of engagement, both with the public and also with stakeholders, partners in the city, and folks from all across the region. That has really framed and shaped what the plan has become. So I think it's really important grounding. So over the last 14 to 16 months, we have gone through many, many stages, which you can see depicted here. And I'm gonna make some things disappear. All right. Okay. I'm gonna really hone in thinking about the engagement part of this process. We've had the great pleasure of talking to over 1,700 members of the St. Louis public, just in the parts about public engagement, doesn't include our stakeholders and partners, in a really wide variety of places and forums, and on many topics that touch on land use, as well as many other elements about how our city moves. And a lot of this work that you'll see today has really been guided by the steering committee. So we had a resident steering committee. They've been incredibly involved in this process. They have helped serve as a bridge and a communicator, thinking about public engagement. How will the public respond? Who do we need to talk to? What does this need to look like? We had 12 steering committee members who were selected by lottery. We had 11 of them continued all the way through to the end, but one person had some time commitments. We've met over 7 times during the process, and many of them have participated in public engagement, including some of them organizing public engagement, bringing the planning team out into their communities. So as you are looking forward at what happens and what Dan and Miriam are going to talk about, know that this really diverse group of people have really shaped a lot of that content. We've also had 3 technical working groups that have been part of this process. Those were organized around 3 pillars: quality of life, resilience, and equity, and included members of the city staff from a variety of departments, as well as nonprofit and community leaders who have a really wide, diverse range of experiences and can really think about how do we bring this plan to life. They also met over 7 times, most of them within their own groups, but also a few times across groups, really getting into a lot of detail. And Dan and Miriam will talk a little bit about some of the pieces that they contributed to. One of the pieces that's been very important in our public engagement process is really making sure that folks know what the land use plan is. When we started this process, it's mostly the Planning Commission and members of the city staff who had a good grasp on what the strategic land use plan does. So we've had a website with extensive information. We've had a really active social media presence with a ton of information and data and what we've been learning. And then we've also published 3 Sloop Scoops newsletters that have updated the public about our process along the way. I think we have copies of 2 here, and Miriam probably has 3 somewhere if you'd like them. Sloop Scoop 1 sold out, so we can't get those.
You get it on eBay.
Yeah.
$300.
So that got us to, that kind of helped us to get into having people understand what this is. We had a lot of phases of engagement, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but know that we have been actively out talking to the community since about this time last year through multiple rounds. I want to really zoom in on 4 different activities that we got to do with the public to help inform this plan. And let me move this so that we can actually see the top. Oh, everyone can't see the top. All right. Okay. Thank you. Wow. All right. So we kicked off last year in November through January, asking folks in St. Louis what works well and what has the potential to be better. In these sessions, we wanted to hear from people about what's going well in St. Louis that we can build on, and what are the things that we want to change in the future. So we had folks take these boards, cover them in stickers, add their own drawings, and tell us more about what it is that they wanted to see. We heard they want more walkable areas. They want to be able to access amenities, healthcare, grocery stores, parks, and they want to build on the strengths and assets that we already have in St. Louis. From that, one of the things that really came out clearly is that there are a lot of tensions in land use. There's things that we have to balance as we make decisions about what we do. So we took 5 of those tensions out to talk with the public and hear their input about how we balance those. That included things like we want areas to feel vibrant, and also we know that we're losing population. Dan and Miriam will talk a little bit more about that later. We also know that we need to think about where residential development should go. And how we grow where people are located in St. Louis. One thing that was a really fun activity in this is we asked people what is a big change that would shift the narrative in St. Louis. We got some pretty amazing ideas, some of which appear in the plan in various ways. And then in April, we were able to take a very first early draft of the framework plan with designations that Dan and Miriam will talk about in their early form, out to folks to get their reactions, to hear what they thought about it. And then in June and July, we did a very intensive set of sessions where we looked at very specific areas of the city, showing a much more detailed map, parcel by parcel, of how these designations were applied in a draft format, and hearing from folks about how that aligned with their aspirations and their expectations. So that input has also been incorporated into this process. So that kind of gives you here's how folks have touched this plan. And now I'm going to hand it over to Miriam to tell us a little bit more about what it is.
Yeah, so I think the commission is familiar with this, but again, for kind of the record here, and as Liz was describing, we spent quite a bit of time describing even what is this plan and why does it matter, because there wasn't really broadly held knowledge about it. So The strategic land use plan, of course, is a core element of the comprehensive plan, which is a broad, general policy guide for a city's evolution, particularly the evolution of the city's built environment that's authorized and actually also required under state law as well as our local code. So we can think of it as sort of a long-term vision, a high-level plan, and that might be in contrast to a neighborhood plan that can be much more detailed and specific. The strategic land use plan, or SLOOP, is sort of the core part of this constellation of different elements of the comprehensive plan that we're actively building. So the city is also in the process of creating its first, maybe not ever, but first in a long time, transportation and mobility plan that offers citywide guidance for those topics. The city is also in the process of updating its sustainability plan. That updated plan is intended to be adopted as an element of the comprehensive plan. Other elements can be added in the future, and neighborhood plans, when they're adopted, are adopted as supplements to the comprehensive plan and used in a kind of similar way. They're given the similar, or really I should say, same level of authority in guiding land use policy decisions of the city. Land use planning in the city has a long and complicated and in many ways troubled history. I'm not going to attempt to detail that right now, other than to say that the framing for every conversation that we had about this plan with the public is that we need to recognize this history as we're planning for the future. There are a lot of parts of St. Louis that have been very directly and overtly harmed by land use policy decisions in the past. There have also been positive decisions, right? Establishing the city's park system, really wonderful, but many others have caused a lot of harm. And that harm is really, we thought, very important to recognize and aim to correct through this plan. This 2005 plan, which is the current strategic land use plan that the city is still actively using, was adopted in 2005 and has been amended about a couple dozen times since that time to keep it relatively current. This was a big step when it was adopted. The city had gone kind of a couple of decades with, do we, don't we have a formal land use plan to guide policy choices that the city's making. So this 2005 plan was a really big step, but here we are almost 20 years later, right? Just kind of doing a full update of that plan. And with this focus on land use. Land use is not everything, but land use is important to people's lived experiences in the city. It impacts the types of housing people have or have access to. It impacts people's health. It impacts small business opportunities, and it impacts our ability to attract new residents, yes, but also retain the population that we have by creating more comfortable, higher quality, and more peaceful places for people to stay. The land use plan, we use several different ways, but in a couple of cases, a couple of examples, it has like formal legal authority in guiding land use policy choices before the city. And this is a big part of the Planning Commission's role in reviewing any rezoning against the land use plan, reviewing redevelopment plans against the land use plan, and the SLOOP in its updated format will continue to be used in this way. And this will come up a few more times, and we are planning to take the proactive step of fully updating and reviewing the city's zoning code to bring the rules for development and land use in line with the goals as developed by and expressed by this plan, as well as neighborhood plans. The SLOOP, even though it is a plan with formal authority, it can't, in its sole role, kind of actualize every goal within the plan. There will be other policies, entities, and practices that will need to bring it to life, but there is a section of the plan that provides guidance about that more holistic set of actions that can be taken to bring the vision to life. Implementation really is important, but the SLOOP offers that high-level general guide to point us in the right direction. So just an example of an issue where the SLOOP can play a role, but can't control everything. Walkability and pedestrian safety. I mean, we've heard that time and time again about how important this issue is. And I know everybody in this room is very familiar with this issue as one example. So the SLOOP can do things to support this goal. Encourage mixed-use development that improves access to services and amenities. It can outline and provide visuals for pedestrian-friendly design guidelines for new development. But it can't directly implement street design standards or prevent speeding and reckless driving. Other tools and policies and planning guidance will be needed. Another type of issue that came up a lot is the complexity and just kind of obscurity and difficulty of the development process that many people in the city face. The SLOOP in and of itself cannot fix that, but it does provide a foundation for a zoning code update where we really think there's a lot of opportunity to build a zoning code that is much more clear, that has better illustration, that is much more simple, and where at the end of the day, we have a much more predictable process where we're not in the position of having to make so many ad hoc decisions on a case-by-case basis. So the SLOOP can provide a lot of assistance there, but it can't in and of itself, right, update these processes or work will be needed. So as I described before, this is roughly the 2005 plan in a nutshell. It has 10 different land use designations that describe, generally speaking, what are we going for in different types of places through the city, across the city, and those are mapped onto the city at a roughly block by block scale. What are the key differences from the 2005 plan in this update? We've outlined some here just to kind of introduce the conversation, but as Dan in a moment starts sharing more of the content of the plan, I think you'll see some of these things. Big picture, we're trying to, 20 years is a while. We're trying to update the plan to align with best practices for land use planning. The state of the art has moved a little bit here. So we're trying to bring the city up to that standard. The designations themselves offer more specific guidance and recommendations on form of the built environment and new development, including design guidelines. There's a new part of the plan that is a framework map that kind of in one diagram shows how different parts of the city fit together. The process has included much broader community engagement with the public and partners than the 2005 plan included. This plan, where we started, was reviewing all adopted neighborhood plans so that those plans could be kind of a starting point where that guidance was in place for how the SLOOP treated different parts of the city. And as more neighborhood plans are created and adopted, we will update the strategic land use plan where needed to bring the citywide document in line with those in some cases, more specific neighborhood visions that may impact even how this high level plan or general plan describes the aspirations of different parts of the city. There is also this whole new section of the plan with, we're calling them allied strategies that can help guide implementation. It provides guidance for how future neighborhood plans can complement the strategic land use plan. There were several cases in this planning process where we just felt like certain decisions were not appropriate for a citywide plan to make, that they should really be decisions made by neighborhoods through deliberate neighborhood planning processes. So the SLOOP does provide guidance for what those specific questions are. And this plan is being built with the upcoming zoning code overhaul in mind. So that will be kind of starting soon. And this plan provides a strong starting point. Again, not getting into a bunch of the details, zoning and the specific regulations will work that out, but it certainly does give us a lot to work with and a solid place to start, along again with neighborhood plans, current and future. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Dan to share more about the plan.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Liz. So let's start by going over some key qualities of the SLOOP. Actually, I want to start by assuring you that the yellow that actually exists is more taxi cab yellow and less biohazard yellow. It's just a screen distorting it a little bit.
Dan, would you mind giving your full name and who you're with for the recording?
Yes, my name is Daniel Dioka and I'm with Interborough Partners. So I'm going to take you through a couple of these key qualities. So first off is it's yours. And I think Liz already spoke to this, but this refers to the fact that this plan was developed with people who care about St. Louis. A lot of people We heard a lot about experiences and expertise and the dreams and the hopes and the visions that people have. So this is a plan that's up by and for the people of St. Louis. You saw some of this earlier. I don't want to go into detail. You saw that we've got 3 different working groups and a steering committee, walking tours, workshops, focus groups, all kinds of stuff. This map here shows you where we did a lot of those pop-up activities. We wanted to make sure that we had a good geographic range for our activities. So this shows you where we had activities, and the bigger the circle, the more people that we talk to at that particular location. One of the big crucial things we did in talking to people is craft a vision. All good plans have a vision, clearly stated vision, and here is ours. St. Louis will be a city that is equitable, thriving, and growing to the benefit of all current and future residents. By moving towards this vision, St. Louis will affirm its role as the economic and cultural heart of the region for generations to come. These words, equitable, thriving, and growing, are key. I'm going to come back to them a little bit later. Second quality of this loop is it's urban, meaning it calls for a St. Louis where people live in areas that are walkable, where people feel connected to their neighbors and to the history and the culture of the city. When we were out there doing engagement, we heard from a lot of people. I mean, more than anything else, we heard that people want to live in areas that are walkable, where people feel connected. You see some quotes here from engagement. We heard it again and again and again. This is a little bit different than, let's say, the last major comprehensive plan, which was from 1947. This was a Bartholomew plan, and this really pushed the city towards a more suburban style of development. So kind of reflected a national trend towards suburbanization, the development of automobile-centric infrastructure and segregation. Interestingly, if you read this plan, a lot of the recommendations to suburbanize, turn neighborhoods into single-family zoning, to build highways, actually was a response to early signs and early indications that the city was losing population to the suburbs. And the solution was, let's make the city more like the suburbs. Well, we're taking a different approach here, right? So the SLOOP believes that by doubling down on the qualities that make St. Louis distinctly urban, and by undoing some of the past mistakes, the city can reverse population decline, reconnect communities, and thrive. And in our analysis, we learned some interesting stuff. This is just a small snippet from our existing conditions analysis. But what this is showing is that basically, if you look in the middle at neighborhoods that are walkable, where people have access to key amenities and retail services, are the same areas that are growing in population. And they're the same areas that are dense. People in a lot of ways are voting with their feet. They want to be in more urban neighborhoods. Currently, many places, this is no place in particular, and you're going to see a lot of drawings that look like this. They're meant to be kind of typical, nowhere in particular, but you all recognize an intersection like this, where you've got, maybe it's an important intersection and 3 of the 4 corners are kind of auto-centric. So a lot of what we're doing in this loop, not always, but in some strategic areas, is recommending things to make the city more urban. So encouraging parking to be located in spaces that don't interfere with people walking along an active street, supporting active uses on the ground floors. So areas feel vibrant and full, allowing a greater variety of uses in areas, including supporting the historic pattern of neighborhood serving businesses, locating places that concentrate amenities, businesses, and housing near where people live, so they can easily access what they need, and supporting a range of different building shapes and sizes, including historic buildings and new construction across the city. Okay, third quality I'd like to talk about is that this is an optimistic plan that is also realistic. When we went out, we talked to folks, it was great to hear how optimistic people are about the city. People can see what wonderful assets are here and how these things, if they were leveraged properly, could result in a city that's growing instead of shrinking. And in our analysis, we see a lot of reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot of great existing and planned greenways, right? There's a lot of transit investment. We see things like, actually, St. Louis does great when it comes to park access. Almost 95% of city residents live within a 10-minute walk of a park. Not to say all the parks are perfect, but that's pretty good. A lot of great, exciting new developments coming down the pike. A lot of reasons to be optimistic, But we're realistic too, because there are some obvious challenges that the city face. Vacancy, flooding, decreasing population, so we all know that. And this, obviously, we've shown a lot in our existing conditions analysis as well as we look at flood, as we look at population loss, as we look at vacant parcels. I know I'm going through these slides really quickly. But I just want to give you a gist and some kind of snapshots plan. So what are we doing about that in the plan? Well, if this is a typical condition, again, nowhere in particular, but you recognize these kind of corridors, lots of vacant lots, a lot of auto-centric development. Ideally, we'd love to see something like this. So when a medium corridor is fully built out, ideally, most of the lots have active first floors with new developments, parking tucked behind. So ideally. But we are not being unrealistic in our expectations. So we just made this slide to just kind of put it as plainly as we can. So the SLUP proposes a system that'll create a better environment in St. Louis, whether the population increases or declines. We try to focus on improving access to what current residents need, creating a higher quality environment so more people will choose to stay in the city by setting specific aspirations, goals to make St. Louis an attractive location for new residents and taking an optimistic view of that change, inspired by examples from around the country where cities have stabilized their population, reduced the danger from climate change, reduced segregation, and created more walkable, accessible communities. We don't have to look to Chicago or even Washington, D.C., which is reverse population decline. We can look to Detroit, which started to stabilize. And so we haven't identified a number of where we think St. Louis could be in, let's say, 30 years. But we absolutely are taking an optimistic view that the city can grow. Next point is that it's strategic. And what we mean by this is it prioritizes what should be where. So making strategic decisions means being intentional about how land use decisions, policy decisions, and investments move together toward the vision for St. Louis. These decisions help focus energy on places and issues that have historically been underinvested or have high needs and benefit the whole city by making the most of the opportunities we had. So we hear a lot from folks about how we should be strategic, what we should focus on and where we might do transit-oriented investment, where we might think about doubling down on investments in underinvested areas, how we might deal with flooding infrastructure. And when we looked, when we were doing our analysis, obviously we're not the first plan to think about what should go where. We looked at the residential market value analysis. We looked very carefully at the economic justice index. We looked at flood risk in the city as a means of determining what should happen where. And what are we doing about that? Well, you'll see this in a minute. I'm going to introduce the designations, which have various levels of intensity. In some areas, like on the right, we don't want to encourage intensity necessarily in areas that we know are prone to flooding. There are other areas on the left where there's transit investments, where places are less prone to flooding, where we might want to upzone, increase the density. I'll come back to that in a minute. Finally, I just want to say a key quality of the SLUP is that it is implementable. It's a guide that sets a long-term vision. It's a robust tool for helping to catalyze and guide change. So from the day it is adopted, it'll be in use guiding change in St. Louis. Miriam discussed this a little bit, but a critical implementation step is the update to the zoning code. That is the key way that this plan is going to get implemented. And I think, as most of you know, the city's already allocated, well, it's already actually almost started the process of overhauling the zoning code. And I know there's a soft launch coming later in the year of that, and that'll be critical and a long overdue project to bring the rules for land use and development into close alignment with the goals established by the plan. So it'll be way more specific. Okay. So I can skip this for now. Anyway, there's just five key qualities of the SLUP. With that, I want to introduce you to your new SLUP designations. So those of you who are familiar with the existing SLUP, say goodbye to SMUA and BIPA and ROSPEDA and all those odd acronyms. And say a little hello to our new framework plan, which introduces neighborhoods, corridors, nodes, central areas, institutional campuses, industrial areas, and open spaces. we've taken, and within each of those designations, there are different levels of intensity. So we can speak about high intensity corridors or low intensity nodes, or you get the idea. What you see on, and this is a quick table that just spells out at a very high level, how are we defining these different designations? Talking about height. What is the maximum number of residential units per building, whether front yard parking is allowed, whether side yard parking is allowed. And on the right is a framework plan, which is also printed at the front of the room. And it starts to talk about where we're deploying these different designations around the city. Okay, so let's talk about each one. But first, the first thing I want to do is just say that the framework plan is, it illustrates a kind of big picture vision for the future land use in St. Louis. It illustrates the important decisions and directions for land use. So here are some goals that we have for when thinking about the framework plan. What do we want to do physically? We want to connect the northern and southern parts of the city. We want to ensure opportunities for investment that address economic inequity. Sorry, we haven't finished all the drawings here. Connecting areas of the city that have become disconnected, supporting greater walkability within neighborhoods to serve residents, enabling people to take transit, to bike, walk across the city, to allow for a greater mix of uses across the city, to emphasize assets like parks, campuses, and cultural anchors, to celebrate the unique form and shape of the historic city, encourage growth that can be resilient and responsive to the changing climate, and to connect to the Mississippi River. What do you think? Should I admit Jonathan Roper or not? Okay, so I'm gonna go through, I know we've been blabbing for a while, but I think this is important just to introduce you to each of these designations. And we'll start with neighborhoods. What are neighborhoods? Areas that are primarily residential, but include other uses that serve people that living in that area, including small parks, gardens, neighborhood shops, religious institutions, among other things. Neighborhoods make up much of the land across the city. So on the right, I'm sorry that slide is a little bit washed out here, but on the right, you see that most of the city, well, you don't see, but I'll tell you that most of the city is medium intensity residential. So what that means is 3 stories, 4 to 8 units maximum per building. And you see some precedent images here that just kind of give a flavor of what these different designations might look like. Miriam mentioned that one of the things that this loop is doing is offering some design guidelines, and here you see some of them. So there's no place that's going to look exactly like this, but this is what we want to strive for when we're talking about higher intensity neighborhoods. So this is a primarily residential area that have buildings with a maximum height of 5 to 8 stories. Very dense. There actually aren't too many of these mapped. If you want to take a closer look at that parcel map, you can get a better sense of where these are. It's a little bit washed out. I'll do that. Medium intensity neighborhoods, buildings with a maximum height of 3 stories. Buildings in this area will have a maximum of between 4 and 8 units. ADUs are possible here as well. But you see in these neighborhoods, some of the more qualitative things we're going for in neighborhoods like this. Lower intensity neighborhoods, these are the more suburban areas. So limiting the height to 3 stories. This is the all these things will get more spelled out in the zoning, right? But most of this is, you can't see this, but mostly in the kind of western part of the city as it gets closer to the suburbs, and there's already a suburban character. Corridors, next designation. How are we doing time? I know we're over what we said. Should I okay, keep going?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
quickly, I mean, even maybe at this stage, because I think these are a little bit more self-explanatory to a degree, and we can, so maybe hit it real quick.
There are corridors. High intensity, medium intensity, low intensity. There are nodes. Nodes are strategic locations where housing, retail, offices, public spaces, services, and other communities serving amenities might be concentrated. Some nodes build off existing areas within St. Louis, others would be new. On the right, you get a sense of how we're distributing low, medium, high nodes. Darker the color, higher the node. Here you get a sense of what low, medium, and high might look like. And here they are illustrated, a higher intensity node. The most urban thing we've got here. Medium intensity nodes, 3 to 5 stories. This is the kind of node that you find most around the city, as you can see in this diagram here. One of the main criteria, so we've got a whole thing in the plan about how we determine what was what. One of the main criteria that we determine whether something would be a low, medium, or high node corridor was to basically think about existing and planned transit investment. Want to encourage transit-oriented development, so that was an important criteria. Lower intensity nodes, we see, again, mostly in the suburban areas, a little bit towards the west, the more suburban areas. We still think there's a place, obviously, in the city for auto-oriented uses, although we think that there's a lot of precedents that we've looked at that show how you can do that in a way that doesn't detract from the pedestrian experience as well. Central areas, central West End, not much change there. Campuses, these are areas more than 10 acres. So if there's a school that's 7 acres, it's just going to be part of the neighborhood. It'll be loud. Don't want to say too much about that. One thing I'll say about industrial areas is that we are introducing a new designation called flex industrial. So this allows for uses that are less intensive than core industrial. It may include the possibility to transition to other places of use. Open space, we've got parks, but then we also have a new designation we're introducing called other, very creatively calling other open space. This includes areas with few or no buildings, areas that are reserved for important social, ecological, or economic needs. These are areas that are less accessible to the public and may be fenced or enclosed. These sites might include areas that support stormwater detention or retention, renewable energy generation, urban farming or gardening, or habitat areas. Yeah, and then you've got this parcel map on the table, and then we've got a lot of allied allied policy proposals real quick. So SLOOP has a lot of powers, but it can't do everything on its own. Other elements of the comprehensive plan, transportation, sustainability, and other policies need to align and address the issues and opportunities. So what we've done is we've created a lot of what you're looking at here at the top are those goals around, or sorry, the vision around equitable, growing, and thriving. Nestled under that are goals, which you can't read, but I'll go through one just so you get an example. And then under that are strategies and what we used to call actions, but we're now calling efforts. These are basically, they complement the regulatory components of the SLOOP. And they support some of the recommendations therein. So a good example here might be to talk about strategy or E 3.1, which is to reduce barriers to development by streamlining, clearly communicating and providing assistance in navigating development and the approvals process. So this is just a spread from our plan, which is still being drafted. But this is an example of one of the allied policy proposals. Expand opportunities for more people in St. Louis to build their wealth and stake in the city by ensuring that they are part of the development, ensuring they're part of development change. That's the goal. Alongside that, there are a number of strategies and efforts that we've outlined. So, for example, we want to update and streamline the process for review, including regulations, approval, incentives, and rezonings, and coordinate to ensure processes are smooth and understandable. We want to ensure new development processes and policies alleviate barriers for small developers. We want to create a staff front desk program that supports people through funding and development process. We want to continue ongoing efforts to clarify and modernize historic district standards in existing districts. We can go through these in more detail if anyone's interested. But I know we've been talking for a while, and that's a lot of information to throw at you. So I think maybe with that, stop there. You want to say a word about next steps?
Yeah, so like I said, this is not adopting this plan tonight. This presentation is just making sure, especially our newer commissioners are up to speed and that we're kind of making the whole commission aware of how this process has progressed. I think we are asking tonight for the commissioners kind of permission or approval to, when this is ready, like fully baked for a formal presentation and final public hearing and adoption, that you're fine with staff, basically organizing that with formal notice and stuff like that. That's the only kind of action before you all tonight. But the primary goal was just to get everybody up to speed, answer questions, have a discussion here, and then also for me to extend just an invitation. If any commissioner would like to sit down and learn about any element of the plan or, in more detail, like please reach out. That the door is 100% open for that discussion. So very much welcome that. But yeah, the next steps in the work of this plan are continuing to really pull together, like into the plan document. And then we're tentatively thinking it would be ready for potentially formal adoption in January. So what that would mean is, posting notice for that, following all the legal guidelines in December. But again, we're not there yet. Just want to get the commission caught up and do a comfort check on whether you all are comfortable with us proceeding with those formal steps when it's ready.
Great, so, I guess one question, I plan on going around the room if people have questions, but one question for Miriam before we get started, I guess. So given that our goal here, recommended action is to give PDA approval to advertise this for when it's ready, is it safe to say that at that point, it'll be fully complete and sort of would be commission's only opportunity to really influence that before they see the final document, unless we have some sort of work session or something like that, so to speak?
Yeah, I think not the only opportunity. I think if the commission's interested in other opportunities, we can
Arrange for that.
Absolutely, whether that's one-on-one discussions like I described or a follow-on discussion. I think within the next week or so, we'll have a complete internal full draft.
Yep.
That's something, we can share with the commission. So, I mean, I shared kind of some working documents so you could see it all, a little bit of sausage making. But soon that will all be composed together into a more complete product, and that's something.
That will
Absolutely
be available.
happy to share. Yeah.
So about a week that gets available, then the public planning commission meeting, that would be a public hearing in January. So there's quite a bit of space in between that time to dissect, look. Miriam's given an invitation that we'll meet with you. There's still some other engagement that we're doing to get it fleshed out. And then it would come to the planning commission with a formal notified public hearing so that people can come to that process. And then the planning commission, following that public hearing, gets to make the assessment of blessing it and approving it, or even suggesting some changes at that time.
Great.
But we're trying to hear about what's going on in the community, and still have time that will get you products to look at. That will be lengthy, and parts that you want, but we're not doing it and saying, get back to us in 3 days.
Well, I will go down my list here if anyone has questions. Alderwoman Clark Hubbard, she joined us? No? Okay. Chair Boaz, do you have any questions?
I just had one question about how the sloop interacts with, for instance, existing form-based codes in neighborhoods.
Yeah, I'll take so I think it definitely recognizes them and the type of, in many cases, density and form-based principles that are within those codes are sort of recognized and reinforced in the sloop, the draft sloop. I think in the zoning code overhaul, I mean, that will be a whole question, how do we kind of affirm, or how does the city want to handle those overlays? We have not gotten there yet at all, but I would say in the sloop, it's mainly affirming those form-based codes and the land use plan itself.
I think they play well together. I think that one of the first things we did is review. We had a lot of plans to review, and we looked at the form-based codes, and I don't think there's any instance of anything that contradicts anything in those form-based codes. I think, in fact, this is very much in the spirit of those form-based codes.
So the form-based code is available for districts in the city. It's not citywide, it could be applicable for 2 districts. It's been in play and used. It will be tire kicked as to how effective it's been and how much of a bureaucratic nature it might have been in the following work that we do. And it's key that we say that the work that we're doing on zoning is an overhaul. So a lot of things can be thrown out in the process of what we have that exists, including those form-based code districts, or learn from. And the overhaul process at the end will be a comprehensive update, overhaul of zoning city.
Thank you. That's all I had for now.
Great. Mr. Bradley?
Yeah, I don't really have any questions, but I do want to say that, you know, there's a tremendous amount of effort and time and work that has went into this, and it's obvious and it's exciting, and just want to commend the team on all the work that you've done. I can't even imagine the amount of hours that you have all put into this. So thank you for that. And that's all I had.
Thank you. Alderman Cohn, are you online?
I am.
Any questions?
Yeah, so I'm kind of, well, one, you know, I know this has just been so much work and so much effort, and I really do appreciate the staff, you know, taking this on, and also engaging with our community and hosting meetings all over the city. I know it's no small effort on your part. I am kind of curious though, the presentation that I'm looking at that Miriam emailed isn't exactly the same as the presentation that you all showed today. So forgive me, because I was trying to take some screenshots to kind of follow along and follow up with here while going through the PDF that was sent out as well, which I think is just like a reduced version of the actual presentation here. But can you maybe illuminate, like, for me, how this also interacts with the strategic land use plan? I'm sorry, the strategic land use plan will interact with, I know, I believe it was Kathy asked about like form-based zoning, but the other strategic plans that might be out there are neighborhood plans that are out there as well.
Yeah, it's something we spent a lot of time thinking through and working on. So I would say a few ways. Number one, all adopted neighborhood plans should be properly reflected in the maps. So even with the translation to new designations, the idea was, you know, hey, these neighborhood plans have already thought it through. Like, let's reinforce those ideas, but in the language of these new designations in the map. So that, I would say, that is, generally speaking, the case for existing, especially recently adopted neighborhood plans. Now, there will be, as you know, many more neighborhood plans adopted in the future. And those plans will be much more specific and detailed, even on the topic of land use. You know, you can imagine looking at a specific part of a corridor or a specific node and illustrating, here's exactly the type of development we would like to see, and here are the steps that should be taken to bring them to life. SLOOP just does not get that detailed for all parts of the city. I think neighborhood plans in many cases will. Like, if anybody recalls the We Collab neighborhood plan, there were, I think, 5 focus areas with very specific kind of urban design and kind of development programs thinking for what would be desired at those locations. I think future neighborhood plans are likely, in some cases, to have aspects of that kind of add a level of detail, even in the land use domain, to the SLOOP. So I think that's one long piece of the answer. Another is neighborhood plans may, as you know, communities work together through that process, they may realize or come to a point of view of, like, you know what, this SLOOP map, we think it's off. We can amend the strategic land use plan map to reflect the decisions made in neighborhood planning processes. That's been a kind of ongoing practice with the 2005 SLOOP, and one that very much we plan on continuing. I think the third way that neighborhood plans will complement this fourth way that neighborhood plans will complement the strategic land use plan is they are more holistic than the land use plan. So I think they'll get into details about housing, about, neighborhood specific transportation and mobility questions, maybe specific ideas about parks improvements and so on. And I think they're more, relatively speaking, more kind of action and implementation oriented. Like, hey, this park improvement is a real priority. Let's like figure out what it'll take to get that done. Or, this block with all of the vacant properties, this is a real problem. Let's like figure out how we use all the tools in our toolbox to work this out. So yeah, I do think neighborhood plans are more holistic and action oriented than this citywide and very general land use plan is set up to be.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. I also, I'm just curious because, I've been on this commission for quite a while now, and I feel like whenever we refer to the strategic land use plan as it currently exists, the question inevitably comes up, is this a strategic land use plan or is this just the kind of existing uses in the city? And I'm kind of struggling a little bit with that with this plan as well. I'm looking at I'm not looking at the presentation, Miriam, I'm looking at the PDF that you emailed earlier this week. But, for instance, like the nodes, most of these nodes, at least from the ones that I am familiar with, they're auto-centric shopping plaza areas. I don't know if that's necessarily something that we want as a strategic land use type of a thing. So they're low intensity, which obviously, a shopping plaza that's auto-centric with a huge parking lot is probably going to be lower intensity. But if we're talking about like, strategic land use and like what we want to see, like, is that something that we want to see? Is that how we need to have it classified? I'm just kind of curious, like, how that came into being.
Yeah, I can start answering. I'm sure Dan will have things to add. The land use plan, like, definitely is trying to say, here is what we aspire to be generally in different types of places and different parts of the city. There are a lot of cases where what is between the map and the qualities and descriptions of the designations, while there's no huge departure from the basic structure of the city, I think there are a lot of ways in which the plan is calling for something that is different somehow from what we have in parts of our city today. Like, I think several very auto-oriented, I think they are nodes today. Auto-oriented nodes are not envisioned to remain a low-intensity node. They're envisioned to become something more pedestrian-oriented and walkable, described here in the language of this new strategic land use plan as a medium intensity or higher intensity node. So I guess that's where I would start. But Dan, I know you.
That's it. I think we don't want to see what you described. For us, a lower intensity node is meant to look something like what you see on the screen. We've got other illustrations showing this. We have a lower intensity node because we know that there are more suburban style areas in the city that don't want tall buildings necessarily. And that might be away from any kind of planned or existing transit. And so it's not a bad thing if these places are a little bit more amenable to cars. People have cars here, they're going to continue to. The goal, though, is to shift or to elevate the standards such that in a lower intensity node, you still need or should have buildings that front the street. You still should try to tuck parking behind or at least to the side of the lots. You should still have enhanced pedestrian infrastructure. You shouldn't have, the kind of drive-through uses and things that characterize so many of these areas right now. They're a good precedents and there are good ways to do lower intensity nodes that are neither the worst kind of auto-oriented sprawl stuff or something that's has really tall buildings and is not well, anyway, so I think that's the aspiration.
And I think another area where it's. Yeah, I think when you look at the map, it's hard to see how many like real decisions it's making. But I think another example that comes to mind is the use of the flex designation. Right now, when you look at our zoning map, there are a lot of pretty hardcore industrial uses that are allowed right smack in the middle of neighborhoods. And that seems to, while industrial jobs, the industrial economy are very important to the city, the sort of environmental health issues that arise from those very intensive uses are just not in line with the goals that emerge from this process. And so this flex industrial designation, when implemented in zoning, is going to that different uses would be allowed, and that in some cases, I think this will look different in different parts of the city. This will become a real, I think, complex part of the zoning code update. But the use of this flex designation is a real change in how, a real change from how those types of uses are or aren't allowed to exist in the city today.
Okay, thank you. That was actually an upcoming question of mine, Miriam. So thank you for getting ahead of that one. So the next kind of follow-up I have here though as well is like, for example, like well, just kind of closing out my questions around nodes. So I noticed that there's not really any nodes in Southeast City, right? Like, how are these nodes defined? Because like just looking at them on this map, you know, for instance, node 12 just says Carondelet. I presume that doesn't mean all of Carondelet. The node itself, the little bubble, is actually where the Loughborough Commons is, which is a suburban style strip mall. So how are those nodes defined geographically? And I appreciate the, like, you know, definitions around low, medium, high intensity, but if the geography is currently an existing strip mall and our desire is for it to be something else, I mean, what's the practicality here? That how are they defined, and how is this going to change that dynamic?
Yeah, well, first off, I think what we're looking at on the screen now is something we just call a framework plan. And so you've got these red circles, which are abstractions, along with the blue lines and things. In truth, if you look at the parcel map, which we have here in the room, not sure was that shared with folks. If you look at the parcel map, you'll see specifically which parcels get the node designation, which ones get the corridor designation, which ones get residential. So this is a parcel by parcel map, which isn't always the way land use plans are done. Sometimes what you see here is all you get. Generally, this area, it's a node. You can sweat the details later in zoning, but in this case, we decided to have a parcel by parcel map. The criteria we use to determine what gets what designation is a little bit complicated. And we have a whole kind of series of drawings and explanations in the document that we did not include in the materials you got sent, nor do we include them in this presentation. But they try to walk people through the logic and the thinking. So when it comes to nodes, for example, nodes are typically areas where you're at the intersection of two corridors, but where there's a different built fabric. So in many cases, the lots are bigger for example. That would be that's one of the criteria. So we try to kind of walk folks through the logic and the thinking. And people understand that these decisions weren't entirely arbitrary.
So the framework is looking overall, putting a framework that is generalized in a way. And then the parcel data is more detailed. So
That's right.
on here with the framework, the nodes are a circle of an identification of a general geography. The parcel map for the area, for instance, down by Loughborough Commons would be specifically designated for a shape that is different than just a circle, but is at that junction of activity and the streets.
Yeah, just like another example is like corridors. Like things didn't get designated high intensity corridors unless there was a certain lot depth. The reason is because we didn't want to encourage really tall buildings that might overshadow a residential neighborhood, right? Another criteria is like, right now, when you look at this plan, you see a lot of solid lines representing the corridors. If you look at the parcel map, though, it's actually a lot more broken up. And the reason is because a lot of these streets, any street, including Jefferson, including Grand, even though it's generally a corridor, not every parcel on Grand, on Jefferson gets a corridor designation. And one of the criteria we used is, well, if a building faces the corridor, then it should get a corridor designation. But on a lot of these streets, a lot of the way that the platting happened, a lot of the buildings that might be on Jefferson, say, actually face a side street and have an address on a side street. So those are going to just get the residential designation. So anyway, there's just a few examples, but we tried to be very deliberate and very clear with the way that we designated things and not be arbitrary at all. In some cases, we followed zoning. And in some cases, we were responding to strong feedback that we got from folks in the community. As Liz said, once we had a draft, we took these parcel maps into neighborhoods and we said, does this look right? In some cases, we heard this one parcel shouldn't be part of this node. Right, so, but messy.
Okay. So I think I'm gonna close out here with the nodes and move on to my next one. But just from a naming convention with the nodes as well, which this might also be contributing to, I get that like the parcel detail is going to be different and that, these circles aren't necessarily, the quote unquote node itself. I get that it's a little more granular than that. But, to my earlier point, you have in the low intensity nodes, well, all of the nodes for the most part are named after intersections. And then in the low intensity nodes, the 12th node is Carondelet, which is a neighborhood. It's not an intersection, it's the entire neighborhood. And it just so happens to be over the Loughborough Commons, which is at Loughborough and 55, for those of you that might not be familiar. And then you have number 6, which is, I presume, where the Manchester Commons is. And so those are the only two that aren't actual intersections. And the number 12 is the only one that's not a street. It's named after the entire neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. And
Okay.
I think, I honestly don't know whether we're gonna include these names in the final document or
Yeah,
not.
I'm not sure that the
Yeah.
names are helpful in
There's so many of them.
the
so they
intent
should
of
have
the
names.
plan. Okay, I've got to vote for names over here. I keep track, or maybe just numbers.
And some of them are close together too.
Yeah. There was a part of your question, Alderman, that was like, okay, what does this practically mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, in the very nuts and bolts way that we use this loop and review, like once this is adopted, we're gonna start using this against redevelopment plans, variances, rezonings, and any zoning policy change. So if this planning commission is reviewing a redevelopment plan, that's like, hey, we want to upgrade Lockport Commons, for example, I have no reason to believe that is likely, but with or without the zoning being updated, the kind of aspirations within this plan are going to be what we use to start informing those urban design guidelines and those redevelopment plans. So that's one way. I think rezonings that come before us before we've updated the zoning code and map, that's going to be a little bit of a tricky limbo we'll be in, where maybe there aren't perfect zoning districts to advance the kind of goals of this plan, but we're going to do our best to, you know, for example, if something is a medium intensity corridor on the plan, but currently zoned C, and somebody wants to upzone to F, you know, that would be strategic land use plan. But then practically speaking, once we update the zoning code itself, the, you know, design standards and use permissions and so on within those updated regulations will be the law of the land, just what people will be expected to comply with.
And a node shouldn't have a neighborhood name. I mean, it's an
Yeah, I think
identification
that- I
or
think that's-
concentration of.
If we do names, we'll change that one for sure.
So I guess I'm just also pointing out that these nodes also seem to overlap current existing conditions and kind of mirror some of the existing classifications in the existing strategic land use plan. So like, for instance, you know, some of these nodes mirror what we would have called like a regional commercial area. So I'm just trying to think through, like, how is this necessarily the strategic component to land planning? But I'll move on and we can have a separate conversation with that. Miriam, I'll try to get some time in your calendar. And kind of following up on that though too, but moving out of the node conversation, campuses. So, you know, I've talked about this with folks at SLU and at WashU and other places many times, but in other cities, these huge institutions are investing in other parts of their cities and not just continually concentrating and building these massive edifices and campuses where, you know, walkability becomes an issue, you know, access becomes an issue, yada, yada, yada. And that they're not fully integrated into the fabric of our community. They're isolating themselves through building, you know, bigger and bigger campuses. And, you know, one of the, you know, items that I've been challenged with, you know, is the South City Hospital campus. So that's not on the strategic land use, but I mean, ideally, we would want as a city to keep, you know, hospital campuses open in our city and have accessibility for residents to healthcare services. But so those are existing kind of built infrastructure, and, you know, hopefully one of them at least will be reopening in the next year. But it's not identified anywhere, at least that I can see on the presentation that I have open. And, you know, there's no campuses really in North St. Louis except for the federal, you know, Wells or Goodfellow site. So I would think that if we're trying to be strategic here, we would want to encourage that institutional investment in North City and Southeast City, and at least identify existing areas where that could be possible.
Yep, I think, let's see, well, they might not be showing up because they might be less than 10 acres, in which case they wouldn't show up on this.
The South City Hospital campus is the old St. Alexius Hospital. It's not less than 10 acres. It's two sites that are basically adjacent to each other at Broadway and Jefferson.
And essentially abandoned.
I believe we have classified as a node, which should be
That's right.
a way to. Well, I mean, think about it as a connected place in its own right, even if it's not marked as a campus with this designation, but maybe that's something we should revisit.
I think Cone's got a fair point, like, it's an aspirational document.
Right, it's aspirational. Like, wouldn't we want a university in North St. Louis? Wouldn't we want a university? I mean, just the history of my neighborhood and how it developed. We had Concordia Seminary was around when Dutchtown was founded as a neighborhood. Maryville University was in the neighborhood until it left for, the suburbs in the 1960s. It was right on Merrimack Street. We had colleges, universities, seminaries throughout our city. And, we should, if this is an aspirational document, at least from my perspective, I think that we would want those types of institutions integrated into the fabric of our communities.
So I think the St. Alexa situation is, its history is behind us. It's
Don, I'm actually having conversations with people and they're in the process of applying for their hospital license through the state right now. So I wouldn't exactly say their history is behind them.
Let me continue. So, the idea that we have it as a node versus a campus really merits us looking at that site again.
Yeah, I think this is something we should revisit. I did want to point out that Rankin is, which I don't believe had I'm not 100% confident. I don't believe that the current footprint of Rankin and Amic together, that I'm sure about, that wasn't indicated on the previous sloop. So that is, we are reflecting that as, to your point, a new reality, and I would say the language of the sloop reflects the aspiration of really building on that in a positive way for the surrounding community. But I think this is a good point that we should think about further.
And I just want to say it's like your general point about being aspirational. I think any land use plan, any comprehensive plan has to decide how much it's going to do and how aggressive it's going to be about designating land for new things, and how much you're going to offer a framework for, let's say, neighborhood plans to make those decisions. We talked to a lot of universities, and if we had heard that there was a massive need for expansion, we maybe could have been more aggressive in identifying future land for that, but we didn't. I think that instead we are thinking that that is the kind of decision that's better made at a neighborhood scale by people to decide. So we try to be bold in certain cases and try to be aspirational, but not overly so. I think this is an example.
St. Alexis will be re-examined, the geography of that. Because it is still a work in progress for its rebirth, but its type of geography could have it be for that rebirth to be identified as a campus and not a node. And it's appropriate to do that.
Yeah,
So-
I think we should follow up on that and more things. But I'm also not assuming those were all of your questions.
I probably have a few more, but I don't want to take up all of the commissioner's time. Those were kind of more of the hot button issues for me, and I can schedule some time to get together with you.
Yeah. I'll reach out.
Thank you, Alderman Coney. I do want to repeat that there is the opportunity for either us as a group or as one-on-one to meet and, ask some of these more granular nitty-gritty questions. Don't say that as a means to discourage any questions here. Feel free to ask whatever questions you want. Just want to reiterate that there is that opportunity for commissioners to dive into this a little bit deeper. So with that, I'll move on to Commissioner Fowler. Any questions?
No questions really. I'm kind of looking forward to seeing like the full draft. I know there's still some work to do in wrapping up. I did attend a couple of the scoops. I did see a lot of things in this plan that I was excited for and happy for. Some of the residential areas being like completely residential is great. There are some places in South City that I used to live where middle of the block, there's a commercial use. So some of those things I'm happy to see, like we could kind of snuff that out and like make this back to a neighborhood and move a more commercial industrial away from, you know, residential areas. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'd like to see the full plan instead of this kind of overview, because I know there's gonna be a lot of questions for everybody, and we'll have a meeting in January where we can kind of dive deep in everything, and I'll come with like a lot of questions maybe, or a lot of recommendations. So look forward to that. No questions.
Thank you.
We'd enjoy meeting with you to, if you have recommendations before January.
Yeah, sorry. Garmendia.
I'm gonna just reiterate, I think, a comment I made at a previous meeting, which is, and maybe we could have a special session on it, which is we can debate like the, you know, the current, is this a current state versus aspirational state? Like, I do live by the Loughborough Commons, so I'm like, well, aspirationally, I would like it to be more dense. But you know, it's not like we did a comprehensive residential sentiment analysis, right, on that. But I think one point that I would want to make sure, and I don't know whether this ends up in the sloop or if it's in the zoning element following, but what's the process for changing a no designation or corridor designation up and down the intensity scale? So what would be the procedure for residents or an older person to, or a community group to advocate for the no designation to change? And what would be like the criteria that have to be met for it to be recommended to the planning commission? So those are some of the, I would want that, and I would like that spelled out, because that'll reduce a lot of the friction with adopting this new plan. Is, well, what's the procedure if we want to tweak it later?
Yeah, well, I'll say as a baseline, I think we as staff plan to continue doing what I think has been the practice, which is like at least an annual update. To catch just major things that have changed, to catch observations that have come to us any number of other ways, and to update it to reflect other plans. Now, I know the list I just described does not cover the full stuff, what you're talking about, so I think we should keep kind of flesh out what is the practice and what are the procedures for updates.
And two things. One, you know, our 62 square miles fully developed for decades upon decades out in St. Charles, be doing agricultural. So there are criteria for the levels of intensity of these nodes and corridors. And we'll continue to target that, and they're being identified by one of those three. Why I say that is the importance of what ends up being the zoning there is the fundamental thing. Want to install and use something on that land use, or the neighbors want to double check that something can't be on that, will be from the zoning. But the underlying sloop will be, like you say, the generalized intention of that.
And I'll just add quickly, I think another practice we've had is if there is a proposal, whether it's something that's initiated kind of via redevelopment plan or zoning change, and it doesn't live with adopted plans as they are, but it really is like, well, what's the problem? But I think that has been grounds for amendments part of the time too, amendments of the plan. So that like there is flexibility even in the planning commission's ability to make amendments in response to yes, things that come up. ideas that weren't on the table at whatever time the plan was initially created.
Okay. And then the other point I have is, thinking through like some of the secondary uses of the sloop, as a tool for signaling to developers, about the kind of development that would be welcome in a community. That's the other like piece, like, as it'd be very useful information to know for a developer to know if a node is resistant to upzoning, resistant to, like, they don't want higher density. And they've explicitly said that versus it's currently low density just because. So I think if there's any element of like, how can we signal to, interested developers on a parcel, some of that nuance, which is, hey, this is, don't bother trying to propose like a higher intensity use here because it's not within our strategic land use plan. And residents have like actively, are against it and organized against it versus like, hey, it's low intensity now, but
If you see opportunity, then
Yeah,
it's there, yeah.
so something about the like, and obviously, tons of community engagement, and you've heard kind of your varying levels of insight into the different areas, right? It's not like we heard from 100 people here, and so you're pretty confident that like what you heard is reflective of the community, but you heard from 10 people here, and so there's like different levels of confidence in, does this reflect the aspirations of the community for that area? And of course, you get more of that specificity by doing neighborhood planning, right? So I'm just like, that's one of the things that the more useful this can be for helping, communicate our desires to people looking to, change it, the better tool it'll be.
So-
I think that's. Because I think the plan itself should be helpful in its own right. That's part of the goal. I think it'll be hard to also layer on our gauge of like, and here's how, but I think maybe there's something there in the like procedure for amendment that is a way to have an opportunity to kind of get an indicator if an amendment seems like it should be on the table.
So Lockbro Commons in 2005 was not a smokestack industrial use, not a real brownfield, but it was an industrial use with Butler type buildings and manufacturing. In the sloop, we identified it in the current sloop category as regional commercial. So that was the aspiration for it to be in the sloop. The owners that were there still had the use of the J zoning. But then when developer interest came and on it, they knew that that would be permitted to cease to be at that key intersection and industrial use, and to be able to provide services to the community in a little broader area because it was next to the county and next to the interstate. And so it was rezoned from J to allow the Lockbro Commons from the land use plans, calling it regional commercial.
All my questions, thank you.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Hernandez, any questions?
I don't have any questions right now. This is my first time here, so I need to kind of like get familiar with everything, and I believe everything is going into the right path. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hubman.
I just have one, I really actually look forward to working with this more in the city. But I like the diagrams, I like the discussion and of how it kind of that micro level, various districts or use areas kind of transition do other areas? What are the buffers? What are the infrastructure that's in play, the open space, that sort of thing? Can you just speak briefly to the dialogue you've had with SLDC and how this may or may not help them direct incentives? We're in a slow growth or no growth region. We're not going to have high intensity everywhere. So it's a targeted approach. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, a couple of members of SLDC staff, a representative from LRA staff and the incentive team, and also the Green Cities Coalition Director staff at SLDC and the housing strategists. They have been members of the kind of technical advisory and working groups. And I think that they've had input along the way. And I think that one way this could be used, so I'll say, generally speaking, I think there's feeling like more clarity will be helpful in expressing kind of what are we going for in terms of use, but also just the character and quality of development, and have something that can kind of set some expectations up front rather than, kind of mid negotiation, for lack of a better way of putting it, that is helpful. I do also think some of these nodes and corridors in areas where to fully develop them as positive amenities in the city would require like significant change and amenity. I think this loop provides the basis for proactive use of redevelopment plans if and where there's appetite for that. So take, a north side node or any node within the context of a EJI Economic Justice Index 1 or 2 area. In many cases, those nodes are kind of, they're not living up to the aspiration as expressed by the plan. So there could be an effort where, we as staff together with SLDC and some staff could work with the community and kind of think through a more like a redevelopment plan that could then be used for marketing those sites.
Another parallel to that is other business development and interest groups very interested in knowing, part of our history of places that are brownfields now because of the types of use. I was very fascinated with the flex criteria. And so the flex criteria would end up being a type of industrial use that could be more compatible in an area that it's not all railroad tracks and barge traffic, but near Cherokee Street. And the industrial purposes that are going on are people that are in white lab coats producing something. And that type of thing was quite fascinating. And therefore also being able to incentivize those to be in places that would be of employment and residential development around it.
Thank you. Commissioner Miller?
Yeah, I got a few questions. So obviously this is my first meeting, so it's a fireball. So percent complete, what are you saying overall? 80%, 90%, 75, what are you saying? 85. Okay, so January, you mentioned that a couple of times. Is there a reason for January? Is February or December? Is something happening in January? Is there a threshold that needs to be met legally? Funding wise, financial.
Yeah.
Running out of consultant money.
So one of the things is also to remember is from early on, we solicited and created a advisory steering committee and been meeting with them. I want to use the word constantly, but it's consistently. And one, we talked about was fascinating hearing their applications and getting them. They've been very passionate about doing these multiple times with them. To hear what we're saying, observe what we're saying, and then elbow us and help us. So that's been going on for quite a while prior to this stage here. And changes have been made and reflections have been had and great discussions have been had. We want to, of course, as we're moving from 85 to 99%, is refresh ourselves with them and also talk about them having been this selected group to look at this, how they feel about it and their recommendation.
Okay. I mean, I do have other questions that I think Miriam and Don, we can get into. But there's a couple of things we just talked about, aspirational form that this is gonna take in terms of its distribution to the public. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because I think, I mean, the full plan document will be a beefy thing. Like, we don't think that that's gonna work for people.
400 pages.
But we've been talking about like, what does a kind of executive summary look like that can really stand on its own and give people what they need to like really get the big ideas in the plan. And I think with the users of that being, yes, various like city folks, but also community organizations, like any resident, developers, community development corporations, like everybody could have something that, you know, is easy enough for us to reproduce to like get in more people's hands. And I think that would be physically and online both.
And you mentioned some of those are working groups that we're in. One of the things why I sort of smiled is the 2005 document is a piece of paper that's 40 by 36 inches.
Right there.
Yeah, right there, with a map on one side. And information and commentary on the back. Yeah. It rolls up. Nobody's beautiful, right? Get that back there. So it folds up to the one document. Everybody identifies with this, and that was a pretty bold thing to do to get it done, have it be a legal document. And it folds up into one document. And not everybody in our community really knows about it. And so we know we're building on something that's beyond that in terms of contemporary practice. And your very question will be, or your challenge to us, is how get it out in the community and understood.
So,
Right, and
yeah.
that's the other thing, so I like to always, begin with the end,
Yeah.
where are we going? And what are you gonna give people? What should it look like? And that ties into my last question was about aspirational versus documentation of what we're doing. Can we, to me, we're, just from this look, so I've got to look at more, and you've told me some things that are more aspirational, but I've heard other comments, and I think, are those things targeted? Can I get a list? I mean, or do we know? What are the things that are more aspirational? I'd like to see a list of those things that are not really there now, and that's feedback. I think those things ought to be identified.
Yeah, so it's been surprising to me at times, even in 2006. Some folks don't want in the planning profession would sometimes say, oh, yeah, that's the sloop, that's the existing land use.
Right.
And well, no,
That's right.
much of it is what's there merits and should continue to be there. But there are portions that are aspirational to say this happening here or allowed to happen here will be to the benefit of a radius around them. And we just know what you're saying is, could we decipher where some of those types of spots are? And I think we can.
You know, we put that list together.
Your earlier point, it just so happens that tomorrow, at what time, we have a session to review a draft of the new version of this, to take away the thing that's gonna be disseminated.
And there'll also be an online, like interactive
Yeah.
version of the detailed map, so people can like zoom into their address, like, well, what stuff's near me?
Well, when you put it out there in the community, there are themes that people want to kind of zero in on. You know, why are you doing this? You want St. Louis to be better. Well, how can it be better? And your strategic plan kind of revolves around those aspirations.
Right.
I mean, it's the difference between a plan and a map.
Right, because there were a couple slides at the beginning that put those goals and defined them in a couple of different ways. And we ought to help and be able to interpret and say, oh yeah, in effect, that is shown most clearly in this geography of the map.
My last question is, so there's no node in the bill. You had a lot of meetings there. You showed that on your plan, meetings there. Is there a reason there's no node there?
Take a look.
Yeah,
So- Corridor,
yeah, there are corridors, and I'll come back to that in a second. I think with the nodes, one of the key criteria was like, are there deep parcels on commercial streets? And there just aren't that many of those types of conditions in the bill. One of the questions that I keep asking myself, because there is a corridor, of course, on Dr. MLK, Central Bridge, Grand and Kings Highway. But I mean, looking at the zoning map and also, I mean, knowing a little bit about the neighborhood, like there is this legacy of kind of commercial streets north, south within the neighborhood. And like we've wrestled as a team, like should these be additional corridors through the neighborhood that would expand kind of the emphasis on should there be commercial amenities?
And I get that. It's a neighborhood plan issue to a degree.
Right.
But from a high level historical perspective, it's a no. If no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The neighborhood is in-
Yeah, I mean, it was an institutional
Yeah.
and residential neighborhood, not a commercial. Well, there was a commercial life too, and Martin Luther King and those other streets. But they served the residential and the institutional uses. You know, we were talking about the colleges, Oral College and all that. So, I don't know, that was my question
Well,
about that,
and-
so.
That raises, and it connects to Commissioner Cohn's question too.
Right.
One of the workshops we had in the Ville, somebody was like, well, there are all of these schools, like we kind of have campus, like historically. And I think there's like a huge opportunity to say, we want to rebuild this as kind of a campus that's a collection of institutions. We don't have to make this choice, but we had thought, well, maybe that's really a neighborhood planning question. But I think it would also, this is just me speaking, I think it would be appropriate to put that on the table in this loop for the neighborhood to refine or consider in neighborhood plan, because that did come directly out of engagement.
and as we were talking with Alderman Cohn about the hospital complex in South City that has suffered. But it's a large geography and there's an aspiration for it to come back and be serving the community. In the Ville, there are sort of two types of geographies. The whole around Sumner High School and the other schools, the Homer G and it's now a residential use. And Annie Malone. Is that a node of a type in a residential area? We ought to think about it and tire kick that. It may be something that, or a campus, or it may get identified in the neighborhood. Along Dr. King, there it's, one, census tracts have a certain qualification to help for some investment there, the Economic Justice Action Plan. And lo and behold, Hillock Electric site, long gone from moving to overseas, is becoming a new use. And sometimes we're thinking about that as a use, but we're thinking about that being spread down a corridor that includes and goes closer to Rankin. Now, Rankin by itself is an institution and a campus. Should we double check on that? Because there's also the new advanced manufacturing identity that's going to be for that. And what they've been working on with the city is what's going to be the right zoning for that. And it ends up being likely a community unit plan, which is a geography. And so of the two areas that we've had with discussion with you guys, that we go back to tire kick is both what Alderman Cohen mentioned and that area of the bill.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just remembering this discussion we had internally, and I'm looking at it on the map, and it's like, there's the corridor, but there's no, like, what is there, like a recognizable, intersection there that's in the same way that, like, Natural Bridge and Grand might be like, recognizable.
So one of the things.
Intersection where
Campus idea.
One of the ideas, one of the things that I insisted on for years in the past, we had a map that showed Dr. Martin Luther King. At Sarah, put a label on it and say, Cortex is 2.3 miles to the south. And so, because of that whole node that became the Cortex, innovation district is, hey, Sarah connects you from Dr. King right there. And then we got to remember that. So, and Sarah has seen some rebirth along by itself with the McCone Barron and the other things. So we're going to look at.
Yeah, I mean, the street issue, just don't seem right that drives the node designation. The street, and that is one of the challenges that a neighborhood plan to build, but it's bigger than a neighborhood plan. I mean, they've been wrestling with that, having the resources to wrestle with that for 30 years. Because you have a lot of historic buildings and you definitely have historic houses. So you just don't want to ram a street through it. So, we're trying to save you, and you end up like Market Street in 1950. So,
And so, it does get interesting about the development where the advanced manufacturing would go. That's new. Rankin is there, is a campus, and then, the middle school. So, good comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, not sure, Miller, any other questions? Okay, did I miss anyone online? I'll move to myself. I do have a couple of sort of nitty gritty questions that I think would be more appropriate for like a working session, and it sounds like a few of us have some additional questions as well. So maybe I'll work with Tracy and I will work with Don and Miriam, and we can get something scheduled for all of us to, if we want to dive in deeper to this. For example, like I'm curious on why not all transit stops would be a node. I'm curious on, it talks about connecting to the river, but there's just sort of nebulous arrows leading to the riverfront and not really anything going on there. So just some questions I had.
What I'm smiling is I'm glad you're putting them on the table now.
Yeah. Well, and so that brings me to my next point is, we're asked here is to vote to the PDA move this to advertise for a public hearing where it'd theoretically be the finalized document, and hopefully we get a good amount of public participation that we're asking questions. And I'm wondering, I could easily see that ballooning into a 6-hour meeting if we all have a bunch of questions. And then the public has a whole bunch of questions. I think it'd be more useful to have sort of a working session prior to that, where we could all get comfortable with what's being presented at this meeting, so that we can leave time for any final questions we may have, but also leave enough time for the public. I will say, without having seen sort of the final draft, I'm a little wary that, you know, I don't know how comfortable I would feel voting for saying it's ready for prime time for a public hearing without necessarily seeing final draft. I'm wondering if would be more appropriate to continue this to a future planning commission meeting until we can have that working session, but others might feel differently on that.
Can I ask
Just
some follow-up on that one?
Yeah.
issue? How does it impact your schedule if if we were to?
So why don't
So
you,
the reason we had been thinking about asking for that permission this time rather than in December is because we had been hoping to have the public draft out longer than just the 20-day notice period that's required by law. That's why we're asking tonight rather than December. But we can take this back up in December, and I'll also say, like, the October event was really about getting the bones of the plan out there for the public. So I guess I don't want to suggest that. Well, the details matter and we need to get them right and have public input in that. I don't want to suggest that like it makes sense to kind of open the planning process like wide back open, because like we have had some pretty thorough engagement work in this process. But here's what I might offer as a path forward. We find a time with the full commission.
full commission or?
Anyone who's interested.
Any interested number of commissioners to have more of a working session in early December, so we can share a rough, like, working draft of the plan. So when it's ready in the next couple of weeks, and people could spend some time with that. We can have individual conversations as people are interested, but then have a work session in December and then take the question of permission for scheduling back up at the formal December meeting.
Yeah, and let's talk about, you mentioned the 20 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's put that in the context that we have to have publications of the document that we want people to be reviewed and be able to come to the public hearing out and in notice 20 days in advance of our planning commission.
Some math real quick.
So,
Sure I have it.
so the thought of it in January was the release of the formal documents was to be on what date for what planning commission meeting?
It was the January
The January,
9th, January,
yeah,
not the 9th.
I think it is the 8th, the second Wednesday in January. So if I'm,
So I was to go back to my question, if it made it in February, what happens?
No crisis.
no problem.
Yeah, yeah.
No problem.
And so while we're just doing that math, working back from the 8th means it be published and noticed right before the holidays. And I know all of you, wake up Christmas morning and unwrap it and do it. Maybe we ought to think about the 20-day period and the start of it a little bit more strategically.
It seems
Yeah, I think-
hard to get people's attention.
Yeah,
No.
I mean, we had thought having a full draft available for the public to review if it's ready in early December rather than kind of midway through December seemed like a more accessible time for people. And I mean, as the project manager for this, of course, I wanted to continue moving forward and come to completion, but we also don't need to rush it. So I think what I would suggest is we find some sort of work session time in early December, take back up the question of permission to advertise for a hearing at December, at that time, talk about what makes the most sense in terms of making a document accessible to the public for that final review, and then proceed accordingly.
And then I'll ask Marion a question. In terms of February, do we have other things in our workflow that thinks our February meeting is going to be a monster?
No,
So-
I think there is, I think the only internal urgency I feel is an eagerness to start the zoning code work and kind of, because I know that that is really where the rubber will meet the road. And, I'll say, and these things can dovetail to a degree. Like, we don't have to have one fully, like, we know generally where this is going. I don't think we're gonna come back and be like, rural zoning for the whole city. So I think, even though I feel urgency to kind of tie a bow on this so we can focus on this next big process, I can chill out and we can do this deliberately.
And we have lots of things going on. We just want to make sure we open our eyes and say, if we're moving to one, we're not obligated to every second Wednesday. We can move things around. That.
Yeah.
And we just wanted to make sure that if we moved it into September, excuse me, into February, we weren't all of a sudden making a dramatic decision on something else that's on our plate or other context.
Yeah, nothing's coming to mind for me. I think in a way, I mean, this might be, who knows, making you all feel a certain way, but in a way, it could be good timing in terms of the commission's workflow, because it'll be those March and April sessions where we're doing some work planning ahead for the rest of the year. And so maybe if the timing works to kind of wrap up the sloop, then in January or February, call it. That is all still consistent with the commission's workflow.
And there are some times when we do have the public hearing. And we love everything to sort of be a nice bouillabaisse that comes and at the public hearing, everything cooks and it's nice and together and delightful to eat. But the planning commission on that night has the option to act on it. Or we could also just say, well, let's leave another window open of 10 days and have a follow-up meeting to finally bless it. And there might be some tweaks that we do in that day process. And of course, we remind everybody that's involved in the process that the final deliverable from the consultants are all available to us in an electronic format. So 6 months from now, if something prompts us to want to change it, we have the document not etched in granite, but in electronics, and we can change
And yet my phone
That all sounds good, and yeah, I don't want you all to take this as like, oh, there's major concerns. I think some of us would just like the opportunity to maybe review a little bit more thoroughly, so.
Sure. One more quick follow-up. When will the draft be available to us to start doing our homework before this review session? For this working session?
Yeah, I think that's, call it before Thanksgiving, because we're meeting tomorrow as a team. I've seen a lot of the written content, like I've reviewed every, but it's different when you start laying it out. So call it before Thanksgiving.
it. And we've been having staff use versions of what we have now with, oh, hey, wait a second. We use the sloop to review a redevelopment plan. Well, we now have this draft for this one. Let's take a previous redevelopment plan and test run it against the new sloop and have some of those types of experiences.
We've been road testing and a couple of times, a pre-application call, someone interested in the rezoning, but that might not hit a commission agenda until like March of next year. We said, well, this might be the new guidance in place. And so that's been kind of some practice also that's been valuable. And so far it's gone smoothly with applicants and members of the public.
And then, thank you. And I hope we now have a couple of things that are on the clock that aren't just ticking away in the sense that who's rushing us. I think we're doing good. But I'm going to remind you that as we go into next year, we will bringing you an update to the sustainability plan, new sustainability plan, and the transit and mobility plan. And that they will all end up being adopted in our purview during the course of 2025. That help with our guidance for what we review at the planning commission. The zoning update, zoning overhaul, will take a while. So thank you, guys.
Great. So I believe we still need a motion, correct? I don't know exactly. No, we just need to continue.
Table this till
Yeah.
next meeting. Is that the motion?
Or continue to the next meeting.
Yeah,
Do we
direct
need a
staff
formal-
to schedule a work session with any specific commission interested.
David, should we ask for a motion to continue?
Yeah, I would say continue this item to the next meeting.
That's our attorney speaking from above.
We need a formal motion for that, David.
I'll make
Yeah, I think since you started the process, I think that would be a good idea.
I motion to continue this to the next planning commission meeting.
Second, Commissioner Boaz.
Moved and seconded. Have a vote, please.
Alderman Cone.
Sorry. Well, without Alderman.
Commissioner Boaz,
Aye.
Commissioner Bradley,
Aye.
Commissioner Fowler.
Aye.
Commissioner Garmendia. Commissioner Hernandez,
Aye.
Commissioner Hubman,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller.
Aye.
Chairman,
Aye.
all present voting aye, and the motion passes.
Great, thank you. All right, that was doozy.
Fire hose.
Thank you, Dan, Liz, for your time walking us through that, and to see you again soon.
You will.
Go over some of the All right, with that, we will move on to our second action item, which is a review of the amendments to Board Bill 114. The special residential uses. And who is here again?
Anybody needs water or?
Yeah, we do have water up here.
Thanks for getting it. All right, so this is our second and final item. So this is a back up here. At the last meeting, the Planning Commission reviewed and initiated a series of proposed regulations, zoning regulations for managing special residential uses in the city. Since that time, the Board of Aldermen has taken up those recommended regulations and amended them in 4 ways. And so tonight, the Planning Commission is reviewing those proposed amendments. Planning Commission reviewing those proposed amendments because this is kind of consistent with the Planning Commission's kind of obligations under state law that any zoning regulation that is changed in the city must be reviewed by the Planning Commission. So even though the kind of general spirit of the regulations has already been reviewed by the Planning Commission, these amendments are substantive, and so they require review by the Planning Commission to kind of fully do justice to the procedural expectations related to zoning and state law. So the action tonight before the Planning Commission is simply to affirm these amendments or recommend against the amendments. So special residential uses are and this was, of course, discussed in detail at the last meeting, I'm going to try to present these amendments in the context fairly concisely. So special residential uses are a range of.
Ask a procedural question about, you mentioned about review. Since you approved them and now they've been amended, if you did not approve the amendments will still go through, right?
So if the planning commission voted to recommend against the amendments or any one of the amendments, then the implication would be that it in the ordinance for the planning commission and maybe the zoning, sorry, if the planning commission issues a negative recommendation on any item, then for the Board of Aldermen to pass it, it would require a 2/3 vote of the majority of the board rather than a simple majority. And only a simple majority would be required if these amendments were affirmed. So special residential uses are kind of a range of unique housing options for community members not adequately served by other types of housing available in the marketplace. So a range of things: boarding houses, dormitories, group homes, halfway houses, rooming houses, shelters, and transitional housing. Often, these uses combine housing with social services and other supports for people who are facing challenges. Special residential uses are currently regulated through 2 land use approvals processes. Only one is outlined in the zoning code. The first is this plat and petition process. And that involves a collection of signatures by an applicant from property owners or registered voters within 500 feet of a proposed use. And if an applicant is successful in this process, only then may they enter the zoning approvals process. And like any other either building permit or occupancy permit, the permit would be reviewed against the relevant zoning regulations for the proposed use. Currently, most special residential uses are conditional in at least some districts, but there are no clear requirements. The definitions are very inconsistent and in some cases fairly anachronistic and not really attuned to kind of the modern needs for these types of uses. And shelters are currently prohibited in all districts, which means that for one to be permitted through the zoning approvals process, they would need to go through the plat and petition process, submit an application for either a building or occupancy permit, be denied, and then they would have the opportunity to appeal to the Board of Adjustment. And variances that are granted for a shelter, like any variance, would run with the land rather than be tied to a specific applicant as they would be in the conditional use process. So the context for tonight's review, so the plat and petition process is outlined in Title 25 of our revised Code of Ordinances, which is buildings and construction. That is not the zoning code, so any changes to that would actually not be subject to planning commission review, and there are no proposed changes at this time. However, any change to the zoning code is subject to planning commission review. And in this case, the changes have been recommended by the planning commission and then taken up by the Board of Aldermen and further amended. So that is where we are today.
With public hearings occurring at the Board of Aldermen.
That's right. And at the last planning commission meeting, there's not a public hearing during this meeting tonight. So the regulatory goals, and this is kind of restating what I shared at the previous meeting. The updated regulations, I would not say are really aimed at making it easier for special residential uses to open in the city. Rather, the focus of the regulations is to create a much more clear and predictable zoning pathway by which these uses, which I'll start calling them SRUs, will be evaluated and permitted. Because right now, like I said, there's no clear requirements. The definitions are really out of date or missing in a lot of cases. to preserve opportunities for community input and to provide the city with some more transparency into shelters and transitional housing facilities through the requirement of an operations plan. So this is an overview of the new chapter as proposed by the Planning Commission. It includes a plainly stated purpose, clear definitions of the various types of SRUs, a use table that defines where uses would be permitted conditionally or not allowed. It establishes clear conditions and site requirements that would be considered through the conditional use process. And it requires a detailed operations plan. And the goal there is to ensure that shelter operators have and provide the city with a clear plan to adequately meet the needs of individuals they're serving, while also having a plan for kind of managing the challenges associated with the operation of SRUs and mitigating or avoiding any negative impacts on their surrounding properties. And what I've put here in these little yellow boxes are the 4 amendments that have been made by the Board of Aldermen in the legislative process in the last month or so. So the first and third amendments were to the operations plan language. The second amendment, I'll say the first and second were made in committee at the Housing, Urban Development and Zoning Committee. The third and fourth were made on the full floor of the Board of Aldermen during perfection. So the second was an amendment to one of the site requirements that I'll share here in a second. And then the fourth amendment was to the use table. So walking through one by one here, the first amendment was to one of the requirements within the operations plan submission. And I've outlined it here, which is simply to require an affirmative statement by the applicant that the information being submitted in the operations plan is an accurate representation of planned operations. So here, the intent, I believe, was simply to strengthen the expectation that the operations plan was fully considered and is truthful and was a kind of well-considered approach to operations of the proposed facility.
That entire text up there is part of the Board of Aldermen board bill.
That's right. This letter C is the full summary of what is required in the operations plan. What is highlighted is simply what was proposed to be added or what was added to the board bill through the first amendment at the HUD's committee.
And back to us.
Yeah. So that's number one. Number two is a change to the spacing or distance site requirement. So one of the many site requirements that are established in the board bill as introduced, which is Board Bill 114, is that there should be no more than one special residential use unit within a 500-foot radius and no more than 2 on a city block. And when I say city block, that means not either side of a street, but the block itself as kind of numbered blocks exist throughout the city. However, during committee discussion, there was a concern that this might be too much of a barrier to kind of proximate expansion for existing special residential use operators. And so this amendment added language that said, however, one occupant with a business license may expand their operation to another parcel within a 500-foot radius through a conditional use permit. So the idea was to establish a pathway for proximate expansion of successful operators, but note that any permit for expansion, whether on sites, like within the existing parcel or off-site nearby, even within this new flexibility within the 500-foot radius, any application would still require both a plat and petition process and a conditional use permit. It just, I would say, benefit of adding this exception is that if somebody wants to expand nearby, they wouldn't automatically be denied at the zoning approvals process, meaning that this could remain within the conditional use process rather than be potentially a variance granted by the Board of Adjustment running with the land.
Because conditional uses can be revoked.
Conditional uses can be revoked. Yeah, so let me pause on that point. Any permit could be revoked if a condition is broken. But a variance is a permission saying that, hey, on this parcel, there is a unique situation or hardship, which actually means that this specific section of the zoning code, we're going to allow flexibility from it for this current applicant and any applicant into the future. A conditional use permit, however, is tied to a specific applicant and operator. So if that were revoked, somebody would still have to apply and be permitted to operate with that specific use at that specific location. I hope I'm a little fuzzy from the prior presentation, but I think this distinction actually is important in terms of the logic of some of these amendments to try to keep more things that could be appropriate within the conditional use process rather than having them result in a variance.
If they're revoked, they're gone. Somebody new could come in the same geography and go through the process again and get new conditions.
Yes. So the third amendment was another change to the operations plan requirements. And this amendment crossed out the prior way of basically asking whether somebody was intending to discriminate on the basis of any of these characteristics. This statement is a stronger expectation that the expectation is that somebody will not discriminate on the basis of any of these characteristics. If unable to comply or to provide the statement, please explain. So here, maybe some commissioners remember this discussion at the last meeting where there, I think, is a shared interest in preventing discrimination, especially against the LGBTQ community who faces barriers in accessing housing and accessing needed services. However, the federal fair housing law does allow religious operators of shelters or other facilities to deny services to the LGBTQ individuals because their operation is considered an expression of their religious freedom. And so this was, I will say, in my view, an improvement to strengthen the language while still remaining with the kind of parameters of federal fair housing law. The Fourth Amendment, I think, is the most significant, and but it's also simple and straightforward in that it previously the use table would allow all special residential uses. Well, number one, to require plat and petition, but then be conditional uses in districts A through L. The Fourth Amendment made in the board bill congregate shelters not allowed in the A and B districts. And the context for this amendment was that public testimony during this board bill's consideration in committee highlighted a broadly held concern that congregate shelters could not successfully be integrated into A and B districts, and that allowing for their approval would conflict with the expectations, especially of owner occupants in these districts. So that, I think that's my best effort to describe the point of view and the concern that led to this amendment. As you will see, this only applies to congregate shelters, not to the other special residential uses.
Can I get you a drink of water?
Oh, my problem's not that I'm thirsty, it's just that
She needs some.
I did provide here a zoning map just as a point of reference, if that's helpful in discussion. I will note, however, some of what the planning commission looked at last time is this gets to be a little bit apples and oranges in these comparisons because zoning codes, zoning districts between cities are really hard to compare. So please take this with a huge box of salt. But that Fourth Amendment, which would prohibit congregate shelters and single-family and two-family residential districts, does kind of, on the face of this comparison, bring the city somewhat more closely in line with the approach taken by other cities. However, the inclusion of plat and petition still as a requirement for these uses, it is a unique characteristic of how St. Louis regulates these uses. But nonetheless, I thought that this was helpful context.
Great. Thank you, Miriam. We'll go down the line again for any questions. Alderman Cohn, any questions?
I was there for all of the amendments. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner, where's my cheat sheet go? Boaz. Yes. Commissioner Boaz.
No questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Bradley.
I have about 35 questions, but I think I answered them all, so no questions.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Fowler. Commissioner Garmendia. Commissioner Hernandez.
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubman.
I hate to do this.
Okay, I love it. Just.
The new sloop where you got districts and nodes and corridors. And stuff. So with the proposed Fourth Amendment, we talked about in this district, it's not allowed. What about corridors and nodes that are basically adjacent or embedded in the, residential districts, and that is that maybe it's just something to think through as you revise the zoning moving forward.
Absolutely. I think the zoning code overhaul will, I think there are a lot of questions that will all be together along the way about how to translate these new designations into districts. And I think there will be also a lot of questions in terms of like how proactive we want to be as a city in making that translation. But yes, I think how we form those districts, map those districts, and regulate uses in a very specific way will be inclusive of this question too in the new code.
Right.
That
Well, just the intent of the amendment versus, well, if I just go here, I do it anyway. Even though
oh,
it's still-
I see. There is
I don't.
there are other ways to handle. I think once we get to that point and think about. I think there are more ways to think about site requirements that can bring that context into the regulation as well.
It's not really a question.
But, yeah.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Miller?
No.
No questions for me. I mean, just a statement I said at the last planning commission meeting, with good design, I feel like any type of building could potentially fit into any type of zoning, but I understand that through the public process, there's a lot of concerns and it seems like a fair compromise at this point in time. So with that, I will open it up to a motion. Actually, Miriam, could you recommend or review what we're what we're supposed to be recommending again?
Yeah. So the staff recommendation is that the planning commission affirms these amendments to the proposed zoning regulations for special residential uses and finds them in conformity with the city's strategic land use.
Dated 2005 as amended. Sorry.
Have a motion. Second. It's been moved by Commissioner Fowler, seconded by Commissioner Hubman.
Previous
Call for vote.
rule.
In previous roll, any objections?
One abstention.
Okay, then a roll call vote, please.
Alderman Cone,
Aye.
Commissioner Boaz,
Aye.
Commissioner Bradley,
Aye.
Commissioner Fowler. Commissioner Garmendia. Commissioner Hernandez,
Aye.
Commissioner Hubman,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Abstain.
Chair Ben.
Aye.
And the motion passes with 7 ayes and 1 abstention.
Great, thank you. All right, that concludes our action items for this evening. There's one designated item. I don't know if Don, you have any final comments for us before we wrap up here?
We, couple of quick,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry.
we can make
Status
a
update,
play, but
status.
Jonathan,
Yes.
this again, some nice news in neighborhood planning, you wanna, yeah, can't believe
Jonathan.
you're.
Oh, yeah, no, I was listening here on the other side. No, well, I just want to start off, I'm Jonathan Roper. I work with the City of St. Louis Planning and Urban Design Agency as the city planning executive for neighborhood planning, and welcome, Commissioner Hernandez online, Commissioner Collar, Commissioner, Miller, and welcome to the Planning Commission. So the neighborhood planning update. So right now, unlike the sloop where we're not getting quite yet ready, we have neighborhood planning in 4 different areas going in the city. And so this one right here is planning area 1 that you can't see, it's cut off on the top. But this is the Ville Greaterville Kingsway East, which we're still at phase 1/2, where we have just introductions being made, but also some existing conditions gone, analysis kind of starting and gathering. This is just on the left side, the Tina Turner mural. This was a celebration that happened about a week ago Friday, and this is just, it wasn't a neighborhood planning event, it was really more about the city. However, neighborhood planning was there and a lot of different connections were made, including with the students at Sumner High School there. So we'll have we want to engage with many people in the community, so we're just making more introductions there. The right side there is the walk and roll tour, which is in partnership with an organization called TrailNet, where we'll do more walking audits and just looking at sidewalk and safe routes around the community. And the next working group meeting we'll have coming up is December the 2nd. And neighborhood planning committee meeting starts next Tuesday, the first one for that area. Planning area 2, which is the neighborhoods of Mark Twain, Walnut Park East and Walnut Park West. They're also in phase kind of 1 and 2, where they're also doing introductions. These 2 introductions on top, one on the left, this is the economic meeting with a lot of businesses at the invitation of Alderman Pam Boyd, with senior planner Alexa to the left, and also the neighborhood transformation manager Shavette Wayne in the middle. So spoke to many businesses there. And on the right, this is actually a tour with Alexa and 2 students who had an opportunity to shadow PDA and learn kind of what we're doing with neighborhood planning, along with the community development organization, UGM, and the Mark Twain neighborhood. So just checking in with more residents there and making more connections. And here's planning area 3, and this is actually events that happened last night and Vaden. This is the kickoff for planning area 3. So we have the team that you heard earlier. You can see Dan on the top left corner. Their Interborough is the team for planning area 3. So this is just one of the events at a lovely place, events on Broadway. They're kind enough to host us, and they're wonderful, just awesome renovation of a place, and on Broadway. So we have the next meeting date for December 10th, which is an informational session and tour with Interborough. And finally, we have the Project Connect neighborhood, which is the 4th area where it's in partnership with SLDC. So we're involved, but not in the same manner, but they have their next neighborhood planning committee meeting tomorrow night.
And just give you a heads up, this will probably be the first plan completed of the ones that were just mentioned, which would happen in May 2025. More to come with just overall with neighborhood planning, just more coordination with, of course, the strategic land use plan, as Miriam does mention a lot, and think about how to, what's the citywide sloop level versus the neighborhood level. So we're still looking at that. As Scott Ogilvy also it was about the transportation mobility plan with the Board of Public Service and streets and all of those guys. Our people will also look at coordinating there along with the sustainability process and more city departments as well. And just coming in the future, we're looking at different what's next with the planning areas, and also minimum submittal requirements just in a future date or at a future commission. And with that, hand it over to Miriam. Or any questions or comments from the commission? Oh, I'm sorry, and one more. And if Sierra is on, if you just want to say hello, but this is our PDA was happy to have Sierra Sabek. She is a Coral Fellow. She is from California, but she's here with us until actually tomorrow, where she'll move on. This will be the last day tomorrow, and she'll move on to a few other places in St. Louis. If you're not familiar with Coral Fellow, it's a program where people are choose to apply to the program, be accepted into a program, and these people are picked to visit different sectors. So one might be a nonprofit, one's a government, which is St. Louis. There's also other ones here in the city, but working in the city. But Sierra's ours till tomorrow, and she's working on more about, there's little informational development processes, resources for implementation and funding, and also education and awareness for planning and processes. So those are
producing work products in those three categories.
Yes, in those three categories, and so we'll have more in the future. With that, that's the end.
Scott, you have anything you want to update? Fair enough.
Well, the December, the standing December meeting will likely include a bit more of an update on the TMP.
Yes, exactly. So that's a good, thank you. It's a good moment on the TMP process for just an update on where we're at. And so we're inviting some of that planning team to the December planning commission.
Or say maybe it's a 30% update.
33.3.
33, well. Yeah. And then some updates provided by Alicia Russell, the sustainability director, about the sustainability plan update process moving ahead. So engagement has just begun. Community advisor group meeting, I believe that was last night, the first meeting. And sounds like it went great. They'll be meeting more throughout the planning process. The website is live, so she's cooking. Zoning code and map overhaul. I know this came up a bit earlier. Contract is approved by ENA and it's on its way to the comptroller for formal execution. So we're gonna start some kind of internal, just getting our ducks in a row, getting the selected team like super familiar with existing processes, code, variance records, stuff like that, just kind of like getting them really in the muck with us. But I don't anticipate that public engagement around this process will occur until, or will begin until spring of next year. But one of the first tasks in this work will be to develop a kind of very thorough engagement plan. And I think that's something that'll be good to discuss with the commission.
And process and challenge is understanding what the heck a current code is all about. Who's doing the work?
The selected team, our procurement lawyer would tell me.
Never mind.
Sorry, not until the contract is formally executed should I. Were you gonna?
This reminder for folks, this zoning contract is funded through ARPA. It does need to be approved by the end of the year.
We are, shout out to Mike Craver on our team for helping deploy point on some of the fun steps and the contracting process, form, signature collection.
I have no executive director report tonight, and there's only one delegated item, which was a street vacation. So with that, and we don't need a closed session. Mr. Chairman, we can adjourn.
Great, thank you all, and then sorry, I didn't mean to shortchange those great and important updates. That was fabulous. With that, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
So all you freshmen are no longer